It's time to take command with former NFL tight end Logan Paulsen and former Commanders beat reporter Craig Hoffman.
Mike Renner from Pro Football Focus is our guest here on Take Command. I'm Craig Hoffman. That is Logan Paulsen. All right, when you put together, like obviously you're for those that don't know, PFF's main draft guy. Like the draft is your area. You obviously look at some of the pro stuff. You have to know teams' needs, all that kind of stuff. But like the draft and watching tape and looking at the analytics, that is your deal. So as you start to put together your mock drafts, how much of it for you, because everyone does these a little bit differently, is talking to teams, trying to get intel using that versus you putting yourself in the position of the team's GM or head decision maker and saying, this is what I would do if I was that team moving forward in the draft?
I'm flattered that you think I have enough connections to get out to 32 teams and get all this intel. But no, it's mostly just putting myself in their shoes, their draft track records, what they need on the roster, and then saying who kind of fits that. Who's the guy that really makes the most sense there? So it's me on the outside. Now, sometimes closer to the draft, I do hear things and do have insight, but at this point in time, no one's tipping their hand one way or the other.
Yeah, none of us have been to Prime 47 in India, so none of us have been.
Exactly. This week, that's what I'm doing.
That's where it's all coming, man. So the thing I want to ask you about is like one thing that I find relatively easy in draft evaluation is evaluating position by position. So if I'm evaluating tackles, you can kind of fall into like a pretty consistent order. The thing that gets tough, and I think fans need to understand this, is evaluating across positions. So how do you, I know I've heard people use the term like buckets or tiers. How do you kind of quantify those and then apply that information to your mock draft?
Yeah, you have to have a strong kind of historical foundation, right, of like where guys should be valued. And so you put grades on based off of that. You can't just, and like you said, it is kind of easy. It's easier to stack a position and rank it rather than put that position onto a board with every other position in the NFL and say, where should we attack? And I think some of that I take into account, kind of historical hit rates and like where you want to be drafting guys with edge rushers, wide receivers. Like those are positions that the early edge rushers, especially, you won't find a lot of elite edge rushers that weren't drafted in the first round. It's just fact of life. That's how the position goes. You won't find a lot of elite wide receivers that weren't top 75 picks. It's a position that you can identify. The NFL is good at identifying those guys, whereas corners can fall a lot more. Tight ends can fall a lot more. There's positions where you can find talent outside of later. So that's a factor as well. But I do think you just have to have a strong foundation and a strong belief of, what this talent looks like in relation to what talent should look like across, the past 5 to 10 years. If you don't have that, you're really stuck in terms of evaluation standpoint. And I do think also the sort of positional, what I was going back to about just like the positional value and what we talked about with the contracts and how much that impacts has to play a factor as well. That if you draft a tight end at the top 5, he's a top 10 paid tight end in the NFL day one. If you draft a defensive end in the top 5, he's making half of what a top 10 defensive end makes. So there's that has to factor in as well. So long story short, it's tough. There's no I don't have a formula or whatever. PFF hasn't spit one out yet to me to really do that, but it's just, you just have to have that foundation in place.
So is it just kind of like your gut? I don't want to say gut because that's an oversimplification, but is it a lot of just kind of like Tyree Wilson compared to Christian Gonzalez and who I think is going to be a better pro long-term, or is there something else going on there like that you're using as a tool?
Yeah, you put the grade on in kind of a vacuum. Tyree Wilson, I think I ended up with the top 10 grade on just based off his tape. And then I also ended up with top 10 grade on Christian Gonzalez. And then at that point, you're like, okay, I have 2 top 10 grades. And then you're kind of just like, which one would I rather have for that at that point? Then you go head to head.
I see.
But you stack up all my grades after I did my evals. And then I went from there and broke ties, just kind of how I felt I wanted to break ties.
And I think that's an important thing that fans need to understand is that it's not like this scientific thing. Like you have things about players that you like, and I have things about players that I like, and we can lead to like drastic departures on players because there's no cheat sheet. There's no like mathematical formula for this. And I think that's so important because you go to the combine or wherever you're going, go to the Senior Bowl, and people will give you vastly different opinions on the same guy, which is always kind of crazy. Like Kyle Van Noy, is that the kid's name from Iowa? Is that his name?
Oh, no, Lucas Van Ness.
Lucas Van Ness.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Kyle Van Noy's former Patriot,
Yeah,
right?
former Patriot,
Yeah.
right? And he's playing wherever.
I was like, I've heard of him.
But what I'm saying is like, I don't really like him, but now he's going to be a top 10 pick. So it's just so interesting, the subjective nature of this whole process.
Yeah, and the other thing is like on the outside, I'm kind of projecting to every scheme in the NFL, right? I'm just like assuming he goes to a spot that is going to take advantage of whatever skill set he has. Whereas if you're with a team and it's like, say, you play a ton of off zone and I got Devin Witherspoon, CB1, he's a press man corner. You're not going to draft Devin Witherspoon as your top corner. Like it's going to look vastly different depending on what you want to do offensively and defensively your board.
Where do you think teams miss the most on that kind of stuff? Like, is it just a bad evaluation of skill sets, of application to their scheme? Like, where do teams make the most common mistakes?
I think they swing for the fences a little too much. I was going to say,
God, yeah.
There's this belief that a top 5 pick has to have all pro upside, or a top 10 pick has to have this quote unquote mythical ability to turn into the best player at their position in the NFL. And then they just pass up layups more often than not. They pass up guys who are just damn good football players who will, maybe aren't going to turn into all pros, maybe aren't going to be that, but can be consistently quality stars on your roster. And that's a quick way to kind of tank yourself, because when you draft those guys highly, top 10, 15, you shoehorn them into your roster. You're saying for the next 3 years, there are starters at minimum. And you force it, and then you don't address that need, or you don't address that position in free agency. You aren't willing to replace him. If he's not the best player on your field, you're still starting him, even if the backup's better, because he has to get the reps. And then all of a sudden you're 3 years down the line saying, why didn't this guy turn into, still hasn't turned into a better player, and you're at a crossroads because it's hampering your roster. I think that's the biggest mistake teams will make, is that they chase that instead of just drafting a guy who can step in and play for you. More often than not. The guy is not going to suck at the NFL level, which still has value. So I think that's one of the biggest things, is that teams chase a little too much and buy into that this first rounder has to be something special, whereas it can just be a good starter on your roster. Because if you do that first, second, and third round, get a good guy, a guy who can actually start, stack 4 years of that, you have one of the best rosters in the NFL.
It's crazy. I'm so glad you brought that up, because it's so funny when you go through, I don't get lists. I kind of go off what PFF puts out. There's a whole bunch of other services. You go through those players and you can immediately see when you turn on the film, this guy's a projection guy, right? This guy, the film doesn't necessarily support that. And I look at what Washington did last year, and it was not an exciting draft. They draft Jahan Dotson in the first round, Fedari Mathis in the second. They got Brian Robinson. But what they did do is they just said, these guys are all capable of being starters in the NFL. And instead of kind of this grade, it was more binary. It was like, yes, no. Like, can they contribute? Can they play? And I think it leads, quite frankly, to a more consistent result. Maybe you don't get the high upside of the pick, but yeah, I think I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, because the year prior, Jamin Davis was a pure, that was projection to the T. And it's like, you're kind of paying the price for it the last 2 years because of that.
Absolutely.
Which is interesting too, because going back before Jamin, and then crossing back into when Kyle Smith was here running the draft room, that was their thing in the first round. Even going back to Sheriff, it was an upside play because you thought he'd project out to tackle and all those kinds of things. And obviously he turned into an exceptional guard. It's a little rich for the reasons you were talking about earlier, salary cap wise, to take a guard when they did. And that's why they don't have him anymore. But they took a bunch of dudes who could play. And their biggest upside swing was Chase Young, who obviously injury is playing a role in his career in a major way, but Chase wasn't going to bust. And going back to a comparison, Jadeveon Clowney. Jadeveon Clowney never lived up to being the number 1 overall pick and the hype, and obviously going back to the one play against South Carolina that obviously took him to a mythical creature almost. But it's not like he's been a bad NFL player. He's been a good NFL player for a decade. He just hasn't been great. And when that's your floor, that's obviously a pretty good way to build a roster.
Yeah, and compare that to, I guess, last year at the top of the draft was probably the biggest example of that. You got Trayvon Walker versus Aiden Hutchinson.
Yeah.
One of the highest floor defensive ends versus one of the
highest ceiling
boom or bust defensive ends. And I think Jaguars year one, I don't think it was close. Aiden was the better player, the more impactful player. So we'll see how that goes. Obviously, it's something to track as it goes on, but the Lions are already happy as hell. The Jaguars are still what do we got? The Jaguars are still in that position where they could be 2 years from now screwed, not getting any impact from a guy like that.
Yeah. God, that play he made against the Commanders in week 1, though.
He's flash, but like
that was freaky. You're like, oh, that's why you might turn into a bust, because you are awesome and got super intriguing, but maybe not actually be good at football.
His best plays are still in coverage, which is wild. But
it's crazy, yeah. But in college though, you watch the film. Like his best plays in college were like the coverage stuff, right? He's like running with a running back. And you're like, oh god, like look at this athlete, like that's incredible. So the thing, I
have had to take that. He should play goal line cornerback on like better tight ends, because who's going to get off a 6'5", 275 guy with like 36-inch arms and press?
Yeah.
Hey, Logan, would you have wanted to see that in the goal line?
Press.
Some guys, like some of the guys who are really long and lanky, like you can get off because they don't have a lot of play strength and they don't move well. But he is like the antithesis of that. He plays good with his length and he moves his feet really well. And so I think that that makes perfect sense to me, because he is like a very unique skill set. Like you don't see guys do that very often. And then kind of turning toward the Commanders here a little bit with our conversation. Obviously they're picking at 16. How would you, if you're them, based on the strengths and weaknesses of this draft, kind of allocate your resources? You're picking the first round. I think they're picking at 48. They got a third round pick in the exchange with the Sheriff thing. Based on the draft strengths, how would you kind of roll through those picks?
I think I'm looking tackle round 1, just because I think while it's somewhat of a deep tackle class, I think it's going to push up a lot of guys who are more late day 2 guys into early day 2. I think you're going to get like the Matthew Bergerons of the world, the Darnell Wrights of the world. I think they're going to go earlier than probably I would like them to go. Whereas if you can get one of those top 3, so like a Broderick Jones from Georgia, Peter Skronsky from Northwestern, Paris Johnson from Ohio State. Now, I'm not sure they will fall to them, but one of those top 3 falls to them. I think you're running in that card and taking it and just saying, we got one of the top offensive linemen. We got a guy we can develop. Because the other probably biggest on this roster, cornerback, is probably the deepest position in the running for deepest position in the draft class, whether it's corner, tight end, running back. All 3 of those positions are loaded in this year's class. So the guys you can get in the second round at that position, or should be able to get in the second round at that position, should be plug and play starters. I think it's a very deep class, and I like a lot of the guys into day 2. So
do you have
that's
a name?
probably
do you have some names for those day 2 guys that you like?
I really like Tyreek Stevenson from Miami.
Yeah.
I really like Clark Phillips from Utah. He's just undersized. He's not going to go highly because of that, but I think he's a damn good football player. I'm trying to think of who else is there.
What about the Carolina guys, the South Carolina? There's Cam Smith.
Cam Smith, I like in that range. I think he's getting a little. I don't think he's going to be a first rounder. I think he's going to go to the combine and not test great. But
the second round guy, right?
The second round guy, definitely in there. Him and Darius Rush are the 2. Darius Rush probably more of like the boomer bust guy. I hearken them back to kind of like Washington's cornerback deal from last year, where McDuffie, very solid, very high floor, going to be a good NFL player. Kyler Gordon, you don't know. I mean, he's got all the tools, but you don't know. I think that's kind of how this South Carolina duo looks. Darius Rush, tools are all there, but you don't know. Just got burned a lot in college. So those 2,
very handsy too. Yeah, I agree.
Seems relevant.
I like Emmanuel Forbes in that range too. The Mississippi State cornerback, one of the best. Some of the best balls.
Fred Smoot is a former Georgia Bulldog, or not Mississippi State Bulldog, and is a Forbes guy like to his core. And if they don't draft Forbes, it's going to be a riot by him at the studio. So hopefully,
that one makes a ton of sense, because he is like.
He's a good football player, man.
He's just ball skills for days. I mean, he finds the football. He's got insane explosion. I think in high school he had like a 44-inch vertical, and like on tape you're just like, this guy can accelerate. So if he makes it there to you in the second round, that's probably like a dream scenario.
First thing, Logan, I didn't know you had an inner Jay Gruden, but it just came out. Hey man, that's just a good football player.
Just a good football, but like that's the thing that gets you. Is like when you watch film and you're like, everyone's like, oh, this guy's not really. He's a borderline first, second. I'm like, I don't give a darn, really. Like if he's available at 48, I'm jumping on that, because he's good at football and he's gonna be a good football player. And so I think that's the thing you were alluded to earlier. It's like there's this it's more binary than people think. So I want to ask you about the tackles, just a quick follow up there.
Well,
right?
hold on. Can I follow up on corner real quick?
Follow up on
and
corner.
then we'll get back to tackle, because Washington's needs are kind of interesting in that, like, they definitely need one, but where is up for debate. There's some thought that the Washington could benefit from kicking Kendall Fuller back inside. Were you successful with them a couple years ago? He's been playing outside ever since he got traded to Kansas City, pretty much. Maybe even, like, I don't know, kind of rotating him in with, they've got some positional versatile safeties that, whatever interchange they have there. So as you break down this class, most guys that are coming out obviously played outside in college because they were the best player on their team. So how do you think about projecting someone potentially inside if Washington were to be looking for a guy with Fuller on one side, St. Juste on the other, and all of a sudden the need is at nickel?
I really like this slot class also. And a lot of them are like technically safeties or maybe like grouped with the safeties, but like Brian Branch from Alabama is the second rated defensive back on the board.
But they'd have to pick him at 16 probably, right?
Yeah,
like,
he would be the guy you pick at 16. He's not falling to the second round, but that's a guy where he falls into the bucket we were just talking about, just like he's going to be good. Like I have no doubt about Brian Branch being a good football player at the NFL. He was elite in Nick Saban's scheme, started for 3 years. It's like that's a plug and play guy. I don't care what he tests, he just is. And Antonio Johnson from Texas A&M is in that similar bucket, in a little bit longer, more explosive slot corner. So those are two guys who are probably like safeties turn slots. I'm trying to think of corners turn slots. Clark Phillips, who I just mentioned from Utah, is probably going to move inside. He's not big enough for a lot of teams to play outside. Travius Hodges-Tomlinson from TCU, who will probably blow up the combine. He's a freak athlete, but he's only 5'9", 5'8". He'll probably play inside. So there's a handful of guys I really like in this slot corner class that outside of Branch you could maybe get with that 48 pick.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, like with nickels, because everyone like says, "Oh, it's got to be a small guy," but I feel like now with the way the game's going, they got to be really good tacklers. They got to fit the run. So it's like I personally think it's way harder to find a really good nickel like slot guy as opposed to getting these guys like you said, Greg, who've played outside their whole career in college.
Yeah, the Kyle Hamilton sort of mold is, I think, what we're going to see the nickel turn into, just because that's so valuable against the run. You don't have to match heavier personnel. You don't have to change. You don't have to go into three linebackers. You could just stay two linebackers, keep a guy like Kyle Hamilton, who's 220. He's never going to be mistaken for a linebacker, but he can do some of the things that a linebacker can do, but then cover. So I think that's him, Isaiah Simmons. Like that's the wave. That's the mold you're looking for, which is like Antonio Johnson, which is like JL Skinner in this draft class, the Boise State safety, even if I'm not put him a few tiers behind that.
Positional value.
I mean, he's so high cut. It like doesn't, we'll talk about that more later. Anyway, go ahead.
From a positional value standpoint, then, would you take Branch at 16, or is that a not good use of the pick for Washington? Specific to Washington.
We're just saying the slot's super valuable. Like the slot it's becoming a position that if you have a guy there, that they are, the Rams moved Jalen Ramsey into the slot. Because like a corner who you would never think, I guess, he did that at Florida State, but like that you would never say, previously a decade ago, you would never put a high end shutdown type of outside corner inside. You would never do that. It's just unthinkable. But now it's so important, so invaluable in terms of to keep these light boxes, to keep numbers game in your advantage, to have a guy who you can rely on in the slot that I think it's matching the value of outside corner to have a good player.
So I got a really quick question about this kind of nickel hybrid position. You mentioned Kyle Hamilton. A guy that I liked when I watched him was a kid from Sacramento State who's kind of like Marty Mapu. Have you watched him at all?
Yeah. I only watched him at the Senior Bowl. I've not watched Sac State tape yet.
Okay. Well, then he's a guy that I would like. I think kind of fits in that position you're talking about. Probably like linebacker / that I think again for Washington fans, like Cam Curl has been that role. But he has some more position flexibility, like as the post player. So if you get a guy in the box that can do some stuff, long, rangy, that's another way they could handle this nickel position as opposed to a pure cover nickel, I guess is what we're saying. Yeah,
and everyone wants, the sort of smaller linebackers everyone's sort of gravitated towards in recent years, but I think those are almost out. Like, linebackers have to fit the run nowadays, like at a high level. But that position is where those smaller linebackers are kind of trending towards. Is those guys who are these off-ball guys in college can move to that slot role.
Yeah. And just to close the loop on corner, Logan, and then you pick up your question with tackle. We don't even need to respond to this, just to acknowledge, like, they also very well are looking out, or could be looking outside to replace Kendall, even if that replacement is ultimately a year away. So obviously I would suggest to any Washington fan reading Mike or anybody else's stuff, like, look at all the corners, because that is definitely going to be on the table for them. And plus, especially with St. Juste's recent injury history these 2 years, like, that guy's probably going to play some this year. So there's the corner discussion.
Well, and also just to kind of like bring that full circle, like, I think you guys probably have your Christian Gonzalez is number one. Your Witherspoon is probably Witherspoon 1, Gonzalez 2. Is that right for your guys' big board?
Yeah.
And then the next guy is Joey Porter Jr., who again would be the outside corner at 16. Is that and I'm not putting words in your mouth there, Mike, right?
He is very much a press corner.
Right.
So that one's, I'm not sure the fit is necessarily quite as, comparatively. Whereas I'm trying to think of who the next cornerback. Deonte Banks, the Maryland corner, is I think maybe more in the mold of what the Washington Commanders want to do defensively.
And that guy's not going to be, he'll be a fringe first round pick
I bet he goes in the first round. I bet he's going to test really well here and go in the first round. I would, if I had a gun to my head right now.
Thanks for watching this clip of Take Command. First, why don't you like it? It lets other people know that it was good, and then they should watch it too. And Logan, we have a new exclusive home for full episodes.
We do. 1067 The Fans YouTube page. Go check it out and please subscribe.
Yeah, do what Logan said.
Do it.
Very, very smart.